Perhaps no order of knights has attracted so much attention and appeared in so many stories as the Templars. There are those who claim that they're connected to secret societies like the Freemasons, or that they practiced black magic with shriveled, decapitated heads, or that they became a brotherhood of pirates. And still others say that they played a shadowy role influencing politics in Europe in the 20th century. Apparently, no claim is too outlandish to make if the Templars are involved. And as knights, they're portrayed as both courageous and corrupt. One of the most famous depictions of the Templars is in Sir Walter Scott's historical novel Ivanhoe, and there is a character, a Templar knight by the name of Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert. And this is a guy who's very strong, he's very competent as a fighter, and he's also quite arrogant. He takes whatever he wants. And in this story, that happens to be the body of a very lovely Jewish woman by the name of Rebecca. And over the course of the plot, Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert hints to Rebecca that his order has secret objectives and goals that are far removed from the piety and the mission of protecting pilgrims and holy places that the Templars were originally about. That now they have a different set of objectives, quite different from these original ones, which are too dangerous to be revealed to outsiders. The Templars have also been recently reimagined in the computer game Assassin's Creed. And here, they take an actual historical figure, the leader of the assassins, and they make him a secret Templar. And in the course of the game, they put this statement in his mouth where he says, "Nothing is true and everything is permitted." And this idea has been attached to the Templars in popular imagination for some time. The idea that these knights began to serve a very different set of objectives. They no longer were idealistic, and they were operating to increase their own power and their own influence. We're going to talk about the actual assassins later on in this episode, but the appearance of the Templars in Assassin's Creed is yet one more reiteration of a version of Templar identity that has become incredibly widespread. As with all legends, there is often a grain of truth. The Templars as an organization lasted barely 200 years. And in that time, they transformed from a small group of knights with a very limited mission to playing a decisive role in the Second and Third Crusades and transforming into an international organization of incredible wealth and influence. Spoiler alert, it ends badly for the Templars. But that is not our story today. Today, we're going to talk about how the Templars came to exist and how they developed the extraordinary clout and influence that they began to wield. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 1 on the Templars. But before we get into the story today, I want to pause and say a huge word of thanks to those of you who have been supporting this podcast on Patreon. Your support there allows me to continue making these episodes and making them on a regular basis. And I'd like to especially thank those patrons who are supporting the podcast at the highest level. And these are Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, Gordon Carl, Agnes Viner, Aaron Silverstein, and Random Effects. Thank you so much. And if you're interested in even more history, head on over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes content and live conversations on all things historical, hosted by me on a regular basis. Here on the podcast, we just wrapped up a series on the First Crusade, and this story picks up right where that one ends. So, in 1100, the First Crusade has just finished. There are now 4 Crusader states in the Near East, and they are Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. You would think that these Western knights, with their tiny outposts surrounded by a very large number of potentially hostile neighbors, would work together. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. We have records of crusaders in these states fighting against each other, competing for control of different parts of territory, and sometimes allying together against external forces, of which there were quite a few. So, briefly, there is the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, and occasionally crusaders ally with that empire, and at other times they make enemies there by taking land that the Eastern Roman Emperor regards as his own. There are also Muslim forces in the neighborhood. There are various different Seljuk Turkish warlords who are fighting against each other, but also against the crusaders from time to time. There are the Muslim Fatimids, who are operating out of Egypt. And then there are the Bedouin, that we'll get to in a second. But what's interesting about this point is that the Crusader states are not a unified body that always fights to support each other against whoever is hostile in the neighborhood. They have a very realpolitik sort of policy. Sometimes they're hiring Seljuk Muslim forces as mercenary troops to fill out their own military forces for some strategic objective. So there is this shifting network of alliances, sometimes cooperation and sometimes competition, that characterizes the Crusader states in the Near East at this time. While Jerusalem, which is really the center point of the Crusaders' attention, is now in Latin Christian hands, it's still a dangerous place for Western Christians to visit. Now, if you listen to the series on the First Crusade, you'll know that reclaiming Jerusalem was very much a central plank of that military expedition, and the Crusaders succeeded. They did take Jerusalem in 1099, and in the year 1100 it remains under their control. But that doesn't mean that it's suddenly a safe place for pilgrims from Western Europe to visit. They have been visiting Jerusalem in various numbers for centuries. They continue to do so now that the Crusaders are in charge of it. But while the Crusaders are more or less able to maintain safety inside the city itself, the roads in and out of it and the terrain that pilgrims have to cross to get there is another story entirely. One of the major problems for pilgrims and for security in the region is the Bedouin. So let's pause for a moment and introduce these guys into our picture of the Near East at this time. Who are the Bedouin exactly? Now, the term Bedouin, as it's used in the sources from this period, is less an ethnic term and more of a job description. And you might have heard the same thing with the term Vikings, right? We used to imagine that the term Viking was kind of an ethnic group, but it's not. Vikings are what you call Norsemen when they get into their longboats and they head off for raids in foreign parts. When they're back at home, they're just called Danes and Swedes. Similarly, for the Bedouin, when we're using the term in the sources at this time, we're talking about bandits. It refers to nomadic people who roamed across the desert, sometimes the Negev, sometimes the Sinai. They're herdsmen. They have their flocks and they're moving them around from one pasturing area to another, but they're usually armed, aggressive, and looking for other opportunities to make some cash. And so raiding pilgrims or travelers on the road is something that they do quite frequently. And it's hard to know when Bedouin are in the area. Because they're nomadic, they move around. They're not settled. You can't really make a treaty with them because they're not centralized under one ruler or one political system. And sometimes these Bedouin are referred to as wild Turks and sometimes as Arabs. So there are different ethnicities that are sort of described under the term of Bedouin or desert bandits. While there are both Turks and Arabs in this designation, these are quite different from the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids Arabs, both of whom are settled societies. People that you could negotiate alliances with a leader or make a treaty or that sort of thing. The Bedouin, not so much. You have some much smaller little clans that are moving around. You might have an agreement with one clan, but it doesn't at all cover the next clan that's coming across that hill. So they're a very difficult problem to deal with, and they're a problem for all travelers in the region. These Bedouin raiders are reported to have worked with Western knights against Muslims at various times, and at other times they worked with Muslims and against Western Christians. They're very opportunist. They'll take prisoners and sell them back to whoever pays the highest price. Nazareth, Samaria, and Galilee at this point are notoriously lawless places where this kind of banditry was common. There are many stories of pilgrims at this time in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade traveling in fear on these roads. And remember, a lot of this travel is going to be done on foot or with your horse or with your camel. So you're traveling at a slow pace through a territory that is unfamiliar to you, but intimately familiar to these nomadic tribes who are a constant hazard. So there are many stories of pilgrims who are ambushed, robbed, kidnapped, or even killed. And there are even lion attacks that are very common in this region. We hear crusaders talking about the need to be on the lookout for these wild beasts that also will attack hapless travelers. Pilgrim accounts from this period speak of bodies lying unburied near the road. And this is because if you were involved in an attack and your traveling companion got killed, you weren't hanging around to dig a hole and bury him. You were fleeing for your life. And if you were another pilgrim coming down this road toward Jerusalem and encountering a corpse by the side of the road, you didn't want to hang around and dig a hole either. You were constantly traveling with your head looking over your shoulder for potential threats, trying to get to the safety of the city as quickly as possible. But imagine what it must have been like as a medieval pilgrim making this journey, thinking about lions, keeping your eyes on the horizon for bandits, and seeing the grisly remains of less fortunate pilgrims lying on the side of the road as a warning. So the situation is already not a good one for pilgrims. But in the Easter of 1119, a really awful episode happened that underlined just how dangerous the region had become. So these pilgrims are leaving the city of Jerusalem with great jubilation. They've just listened to services inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they're now making this journey on foot toward the River Jordan, which is a place of enormous significance for Christians because it's the river in which Jesus is reported to have been baptized. So this massive group of people is making their way over this distance, some 34 kilometers or 21 miles, which might seem like a long walk to you or me, but for people who had been traveling thousands of miles and months on the road to get to Jerusalem, this was a mere stroll. So imagine these people making their way toward the river, and on their way, they're ambushed by these bandits. And some 300 of them were killed. Many others were captured, which means they're going to be sold off, possibly into slavery, never to be seen again. So nearly half of the pilgrims who are making this journey are not going to make it back. And the horror of this episode and the very large number of pilgrims that had been affected all at once really underlined how serious the problem was. Only months later, two knights approached King Baldwin II, who was at this point the Crusader king of Jerusalem. If you've been listening to the First Crusade series, this is Baldwin II, not Baldwin I that we talked about before. So Baldwin I has recently died, Baldwin II has just taken over, and he receives these two knights, and they are Hugh of Paynes, a French knight who had actually fought in the First Crusade, and another guy called Sir Godfrey of Saint-Omer from Picardy. So these two men approach the king and they have a request. They want to withdraw from regular life and basically work on their own spiritual purification. And the obvious vehicle for that, at this point in time, 1119, would have been a monastic life. So 1119 is the early 12th century. And this happens to be the absolute peak of monasticism in Europe. Men and women in record numbers are signing up to be monks or nuns. They're going into these cloistered communities where they're essentially shut off from the outside world, and their lives begin to revolve only around spiritual duties. So the life of a monk or a nun was heavily shaped by religious services or prayers every few hours, in some cases perpetually. And these communities are springing up all across Europe. This is the high point of monasticism in the Middle Ages. Everyone's doing it, apparently. So for these two knights, it seems an obvious next step. They're not young men anymore. They're reaching sort of the end of their fighting careers, probably, because if Hugh of Paynes fought in the First Crusade, that was 20 years ago. So you have to imagine that he's at least a middle-aged man, perhaps late middle-aged. And it wasn't uncommon for knights in the Middle Ages to retire into monasteries in the later part of their lives and spend their last years in reflection, contemplation, prayer, and penance for the many sins that they had committed on battlefields and in cities that they'd sacked during their fighting days. So this is not a unique idea. Now, King Baldwin initially welcomes the impulses of these knights, and he says, yes, this is a good thing that you're asking for permission to do. That's wonderful. But he's also very reluctant to lose men who are capable of fighting to being locked up in a monastery and shut away from everyday life. And so King Baldwin says, maybe there's a way that you can increase your spiritual devotion and your contemplation, but also use the military abilities that you have developed over your lifetimes, because those are really valuable and we really need them. Remember, the Easter massacre has just happened a couple of months ago. The large numbers of pilgrims have died as a result of not having protection from bandits in the region. And so you can imagine what King Baldwin is thinking. Here are two guys who are capable soldiers. I desperately need all of the soldiers I can get, and they want to go into a monastery and put their swords away. How can we negotiate so that they are still willing to fight? So what King Baldwin suggests to these two knights is he says, by all means, commit yourselves to spiritual purification, but also, could you take on the responsibility of patrolling the roads near Jerusalem? Could you use your military abilities to protect pilgrims? Because in this way, your fighting skills would also be an act of religious devotion. Don't look at these two things as fighting on the one side and religion on the other. Use your fighting skills in the service of God, and in this way, you can fulfill your objectives and mine. So this is a really interesting moment, because what we're about to see here is the birth of the idea of the warrior monk. And this is really significant. Now, you and I like to think of clergymen perhaps as men of peace, people who would never be wielding weapons, people who would maybe be on a battlefield, but only to offer prayers or to offer the last rites to men who are in pain and who are dying. We don't think of priests and monks as guys with weapons. And largely speaking, that is correct. But at this point in the Middle Ages, there have been many significant exceptions to that general rule. And not only in the Holy Land. We did a series on the Franks on Villains and Virgins podcast some time ago, and we were looking at the Franks sort of in the 800s, and there are examples of bishops and clergymen taking up swords, usually to defend monasteries and church properties that were under attack by raiders, but the idea that you would pick up a weapon if needed to defend church property or other monks was not unknown. So at this point, in the 1100s, we've seen it happen in larger numbers. Most recently in the Crusader state of Antioch, which at one point was attacked by Muslim forces. The knights that were in charge of defending Antioch were almost wiped out. So the city was left undefended. The knights had met their end on the battlefield. The attackers are moving in towards this fortress of Antioch, and they need guys to man the walls. Otherwise, the city will fall. It will fall to the enemy. And so the Latin patriarch of Antioch, the highest ranking religious authority of that city, organizes the men at his command, who are monks and priests. And he says, okay, all of you guys are getting into the watchtowers. You're going to be taking up positions along the wall, and your job is to repel invaders. So we've already seen these moments where men of the cloth, where clergymen are stepping into military defense roles when necessary to defend the Crusader states. And so this idea has already sort of been witnessed at various moments when it was really needed. And King Baldwin is at this point saying, we really need you guys. So you want to be monks, but we need warriors. How can we fuse these two ideas so that we don't have knights who want to be monks and monks who are occasionally acting like knights? Can we have a stable hybrid of these two ideas? In many ways, the First Crusade itself had already strengthened the conception of religion and violence being fused together. The language around the crusade was, take up your weapons, go to Jerusalem. This is a pilgrimage with spiritual benefit, as going to Jerusalem has always been for Christians. But this time you're going to be fighting, and this fighting to take control of Jerusalem or fight against the enemies of God on the way is also going to provide you spiritual benefit. Crusaders were promised forgiveness for their sins in exchange for participating in this military expedition. And the language around the crusade fused religion and violence. Crusaders were being described as having joined the knighthood of Christ, quote unquote. So there again is a term that's already putting the idea of knighthood and religion, of fighting and faith together in the same breath. And we know that churchmen and bishops accompanied the Crusaders on the First Crusade. They were present during the battles. They were offering prayers. They were alongside the knights the whole time. And occasionally afterwards, when necessary, they took up arms themselves if it seemed like it was absolutely required that they do so. So with all this context in mind, it's less surprising that in 1119, when King Baldwin II is having this conversation with these two knights, that the concept of the warrior monk is finally born. So it was that on Christmas Day in 1119, these knights took their vows in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Just like monks, they made vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But unlike monks, they also swore themselves to protect pilgrims in and around Jerusalem. And initially, they called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. Initially, there were only 9 of them. When they were presented officially to the religious and political authorities of the Crusader states a few months later, they were then granted some donations, some funding to help support their operations, and they were given some sort of official recognition locally. But they were very small numbers. I mean, 9 men is not even 2 hands full yet. Now, King Baldwin had been using the Al-Aqsa Mosque as his headquarters. And this had been going on since the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099. They took over this beautiful mosque that the previous Muslim rulers had built, and they turned it over to be basically a palace for the Crusader kings of Jerusalem. So King Baldwin II is already living there, and he decides to give the Crusaders some rooms or some space inside the mosque to be their headquarters. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located on the Temple Mount. So this is an area that used to have a Jewish temple on it, which was destroyed by the Romans. But because the knights are now living on the Temple Mount, they become the Knights of the Temple, later shortened to Templar Knights. So these Templars initially live on charitable donations, including old clothes that are given for their use, old pieces of armor or weapons, food. They're living very much like monks on the charity that other people give them. They don't have any source of income of their own. And so initially, there are no uniforms. These guys are living in cast-off garments. So the white robes with the distinctive red cross that we associate as the Templar uniform and insignia, that comes later. In the earliest days, there's no such thing. And this poverty in which the order was founded is actually reflected on the Templar seal, which depicts two knights sharing one horse. And that's a very vivid picture of the conditions in which the order was founded. Your horses were donated, you sort of made do with whatever equipment could be cobbled together or sent over your way. It wasn't that every knight had a uniform and his own horse and his own equipment. It was very much a cobbled together sort of unit. The red cross on white garments that the Templars will later adopt as their uniform is a direct reflection of the symbolism of the First Crusade itself, and not just the First Crusade. Those who undertook to go on a crusade to the Near East, the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, and others, indicated their intention by tearing two strips of cloth and stitching them onto the front of their garments in the shape of a cross. This was called taking the cross, and it was a formal way to indicate to others that you had taken this oath, you were going on crusade, and you were now honor-bound to fulfill your promise. So the Templar cross is a deliberate echoing of this symbolism that was so embedded in the Crusades. For the Templars, the cross became a permanent part of the uniform because they were dedicated to perpetual defense of Christian pilgrims and their holy places. Now, some people like to say that there were only 9 Templar knights for the first 9 or 10 years of their existence. And this seems very neat, but it's highly unlikely. 9 knights for 9 years might be an appealing device, but the historical facts make that quite an unlikely account. So this idea that there were only 9 Templars for the first 9 years of their existence may be an example of a kind of symbolic retelling of history, especially if the number 9 is thought to have some mystical significance. And if you're at all familiar with J.R. Tolkien, you'll know that he mirrored the significance of the number 9 because the 9 Black Riders, the Nazgul, were the 9 lost kings who had been enslaved to Sauron. So again, there's this mirroring of the number 9 as something that is a significant and powerful number. Tolkien didn't make that up. He borrowed it from much older mythological texts. And so perhaps those who are reporting the 9 knights for 9 years are also picking up on this mystical significance of the number, and it makes a very neat sort of device, 9 by 9. But the fact that during this first decade of their existence, the Templars are able to attract enormous amounts of attention from the Pope and from high-ranking nobles across Western Europe makes it highly unlikely that they were only 9 guys, because that would be a number too small to justify the level of donation and interest that, as you're about to see, quickly flows their way. So 7 years after the first Templars take their vows, in 1126, King Baldwin II writes to a very significant religious leader back in Europe, a guy called Bernard of Clairvaux. He was one of the foremost churchmen of his age, and we're going to see, when we start talking about the Second Crusade in another episode on this podcast, that he's going to play an enormous role influencing popes and kings across Europe. So Bernard is going to be a very significant player in European politics. At this point, he's located in France. He's the abbot of a monastery and someone who originally comes from a noble family. Bernard was born an aristocrat, but he probably wasn't the oldest son, and so, like many other second or third sons, he goes into the church, and he joins the Cistercian order. So the Cistercians were a very interesting monastic order. They were different from other groups of monks, other organized communities of monks, like the Benedictines at the time, who largely organized their lives by prayer and singing psalms. And this was sort of the emphasis of your life if you were going to be a Benedictine monk. The Cistercians wanted all of that, but they wanted something else, and that was physical austerity, some degree of difficulty or even suffering. And this really appeals to Bernard of Clairvaux. This is something that speaks to him. And so he decides to join the Cistercians, not the Benedictines, and he's going to play a defining role in how that order of monks develops and matures. And this is very important because Bernard of Clairvaux is also going to play a large role in defining the Templars. So King Baldwin II is writing to Bernard about formalizing the founding of a new order. So we're talking about an order here. Normally in the Middle Ages, it means an order of monks or nuns. And they call it an order because, well, there is an organization and an order for your life if you're going to become a member. And typically, any monastic community would need what they called a rule, capital R. So a rule was basically actually a list of rules or regulations that defined what your life was going to look like if you were going to be a member of a particular monastic order. So the Cistercians had a different rule than the Benedictines, who had a different rule than the later Dominicans, and so on and so forth. So what King Baldwin is saying to Bernard is, listen, we've got a new order here in Jerusalem. They are monks, yes, but they are also going to fight. So it's a new kind of order or monastic community. And so we need a rule book, to define how this order is going to operate and what's going to distinguish them, the habits, the laws that they're going to follow, how they're going to be disciplined. What are we going to do if people overstep the line and break the rules? What are our procedures for this? So he approaches Bernard because Bernard has lots of experience with these things, and if you needed help drafting a rule for a monastic order, you could go to no better place. And it wasn't just help with the rule that Baldwin II wanted. He was also hoping that Bernard of Clairvaux would put a word in the Pope's ear about this order as well, so they could get official papal recognition for it. And Bernard was extremely well placed. He did have the ability to speak to the Pope directly. And he does. We actually have his words. He's supposed to have said to the Pope, quote, "Who cannot see that the necessities in Jerusalem are fighting knights, not singing and wailing monks," unquote. So Bernard functions as an advocate for the Templars. He buys into the idea that we don't need more monks wailing and chanting in Jerusalem. We need men who can fight. And this is all the more interesting when you remember that Bernard himself was a wailing and chanting monk. He wasn't someone who was using a sword, but even he thought that King Baldwin II's proposal here was eminently practical. So Bernard helps arrange papal recognition for the Order of the Templars, and then there's actually the formal rule drawn up for them at a church council in 1129, and Bernard is heavily involved in drafting the actual text of what will be known as the primitive rule, and this is the rule that will govern Templar knight life. This primitive rule was a curious thing because it reinvented both monastic and knightly life. First, unlike regular knights who had to be of noble birth, anyone could be a Templar. You didn't have to come from an aristocratic family to qualify. And like monks, Templar life was going to be regulated by very regular religious services and prayers, but these had to be made more flexible because Templars weren't going to be confined to a monastery. Many times they were going to have to be out on the road defending pilgrims from lions or bandits or whatever. And so they're not going to be attending regular prayer times inside a monastery. So the expectation of continuous and regular religious observation had to be made more flexible for the Templars just because of their military duties. And so the rule allowed for that. And it said, if a knight is not in the Templar house and able to attend these services in person, then he just has to say a certain number of paternosters, which are regular fixed prayers, to make up for his absence. So there's this flexibility built in to the rules that govern this life. Now, there were two types of Templars. There were permanent Templars and there were temporary Templars. Men who could serve a fixed period of time in the order, but then go back to their regular lives. In addition to the knights themselves, there were squires and sergeants who served under them. And these guys didn't wear the white Templar uniforms. They would wear robes of black or brown, and they weren't sworn to the full oaths that Templars were. They weren't living like monks in the same way that Templars were. So you could be a permanent Templar, which was basically to commit the rest of your life to this warrior monk existence. Or you could come into the order and serve for a fixed amount of time, maybe a couple of years, which would provide some sort of military adventure if you were a knight from Western Europe. It would give you a chance to see the Crusader states in the Near East, hopefully to gain some spiritual benefit, and then to return back to your regular life. The Templars also had their own priests to hear their confessions and to say Mass. And this was very important because just like monks, the Templars had religious services that were scheduled every few hours all day long. So I've actually found a schedule that was laid out for Templar life, and I'm going to read it to you to give you a sense of what the regular day looked like if you were staying in barracks inside Templar headquarters. So, 4 a.m. You would rise for matins, which is the first religious service of the day. It would involve some reading from religious texts and some prayers. You would then attend to your horses and go back to bed. From 6 a.m. to noon, you would attend services. There was a service called Prime at 6 a.m., Tierce at 9 a.m., and Sext towards the hour of noon. So 3 different services. In between, you would train militarily or physically and groom your horses. At noon, you would have a dinner of cooked meats. It was required that Templars ate in complete silence throughout the meal, while the chaplain would read aloud from the Bible. At 3 p.m., you would attend nones, which was the afternoon service. At 6 p.m., you would attend vespers, which was an early evening service followed by supper. At 9 p.m., you would attend the service of compline, the last service of the day, after which the knights were to receive a glass of wine and water, along with their instructions for the following day. They would once again attend to their horses. At midnight, everyone was to be in bed in complete silence until 4 a.m., which was the beginning of the next day. Now, if you were paying attention to that, what it means was every 3 hours at the longest, and sometimes in intervals that were shorter, like 2 hours, you would be involved in some sort of prayer or religious service every day. And yes, you would be up at 4 and you could go back to sleep a little bit until 6 a.m., but there's not a whole lot of sleeping in the schedule. I don't know if Templars took naps in the later part of the afternoon. It's possible. But the entire day is basically revolving around these religious services and then dealing with horses and military training. This is what it would look like if you were inside headquarters at Temple Mount in Jerusalem. As I said, there's flexibility if you're out on the road, accompanying a group of pilgrims 34 kilometers down to Jaffa or whatever, but there's a heavy emphasis on religious observance. These guys were monks as well as knights. Now, like other monastic orders, the primitive rule had regulations for how the Templars were going to dress and how they were going to appear in public. So the rule contained the instructions about a simple white garment that the Templars would wear, and it forbade any finery or fancy dress, to the point that if knights received gifts, beautiful cloth or furs or whatever, as trade or perhaps from grateful pilgrims, they couldn't keep that stuff. They had to be handed over to an official in the order and redistributed as that official saw fit. You weren't allowed to accrue personal wealth or belongings or finery as an individual Templar knight. Thanks to Bernard of Clairvaux, there was a special rule against fancy footwear, and this is actually quite hilarious. So I'm going to read you the quote. He says, "We prohibit pointed shoes and shoelaces, and prohibit any brother to wear them, for it is manifest and well known that these abominable things belong to pagans." Unquote. So we can see here Bernard of Clairvaux is raging against a trend in footwear. The pointy-toed lace-up shoes are not for Templars. He really hates them. And he must have had a strong personal animus against this footwear because he returns and talks about it more than once, which is kind of amusing. So I'm going to see if I can find a picture of cutting-edge, middle-aged fashion in the 1100s with pointy toes and lace-ups. But this is not allowed. In addition, Templars were required to have their hair closely cropped. They could have beards, but they had to be regularly trimmed. And this marks them out as different from other knights because at this point, in the 12th century, there's a fashion for luxuriant hair. The standard appearance of a knight who was a wealthy nobleman at this time would be beautiful garments, a head full of long hair, a luxuriant beard, shining weapons, and any other jewels or pointed shoes that he might be able to acquire. And so Bernard wants the Templars to appear in stark contrast. Simple white robes, closely cropped hair, no vain, luxurious locks for them, and nothing fancy at all. Now, like other knights, the Templars were allowed to have horses and squires. And the squire was the assistant to the knight. He would carry the weapons, he would clean the weapons, he would assist in caring for the animal, he would accompany the knight wherever he might need to go. So Templars were allowed to have squires. That was deemed necessary for a fighting man. But they had a rule in the Templar order that said you couldn't beat your squire, which also tells you something about medieval life, that knights beating their squires could also be very common and widespread. So the Templars are supposed to restrain their impulses and avoid physically punishing their squires in this way. Like monks, the Templars were completely forbidden to touch women. So if you were going to serve as a Templar, this meant celibacy. And they weren't even allowed to kiss their mothers or their sisters. Physical contact with any female was completely forbidden for a Templar. Now, married men could serve as temporary Templars. So if you were someone from Western Europe, you'd come to the Holy Land on pilgrimage with your wife or without her. Some men traveled with their wives to the Holy Land. You might decide you wanted to serve for some period of time with the Templars. While you were serving with the Templars, you couldn't touch your wife, even if you were married to her. So while you were serving with the order, you too had to observe these strict rules on celibacy. You can imagine how unimpressed some of these noble women might have been when their husbands proposed a romantic and adventurous journey to the Near East, only to discover when they arrived there that their husbands were going to be stationed with the Templars and they were going to be abandoned in their bedrooms. It wasn't necessarily a good situation for everybody, but these were the rules. And the Templars had to appoint one of their own as the master of the order. And the master was in charge of enforcing the rules and disciplining anybody who stepped on the wrong side of them. Now, the biggest difference from monks, of course, was that the Templars were going to be engaged in fighting and killing on a regular basis. And this aspect of the mission had to be formally recognized. And there was some theological gymnastics that had to be performed to make this possible, because Christianity, especially if you go back to the Ten Commandments, says very clearly, "Thou shalt not kill." And this was the reason why priests and clergymen were not supposed to be involved in battles and running around with weapons. So Bernard of Clairvaux, who's the theologian and the churchman who's really hashing out the details of the primitive rule, he has to square this "thou shalt not kill" commandment with the fact that the Templars are going to be expected to do exactly that. And so he says, well, there's a difference between killing as homicide, which is bad, and what he decides to call malicide, which is killing evil, and that is good. So Bernard invents this category that allows the Templars to formally embrace violence as a part of their warrior monk mission. Bernard says that malicide, or killing evil, is praiseworthy. It is something that is of spiritual benefit, and he enjoins the Templars to fight the enemies of the cross, literally. And this is the primary mission of the Templars, to fight against those who are attacking Christians, which they assume are going to be primarily Muslims. And that's what the Templars are designed to do. Some people even say that the Templars were sworn to die rather than retreat in battle. Whether this is entirely true or not, I can't be sure, but while many unpleasant things have been said about the Templars, no one has criticized their bravery on the battlefield. These were not men who turned around and ran away. Their bravery is widely attested. While the Templars began as an order of warrior monks that just lived on charity and hand-me-downs, their material resources began to improve quite rapidly. By the time the Pope and Bernard of Clairvaux are talking about them in the late 1120s, donations are already beginning to pour in across Western Europe. But the Templars really have a major jump in 1134. This is because King Alfonso I of Aragon leaves the Templars a third of his entire kingdom in his will. So, the Kingdom of Aragon is located in what we now call Spain. It wasn't as big as the modern nation-state of Spain, but it was perhaps the largest and wealthiest kingdom inside the territory we now call modern Spain. And it's one of the states that becomes the foundation for unifying all of the other territory into Spain several centuries later. So it's very important. Why is King Alfonso I so interested in the Templars? Well, the Templars have already been active in Aragon in the 1130s and 1140s. In fact, they're not just in Spain, they're also in what we now call Portugal. And why? Because there are Western rulers in these areas who are engaged in pushing back Muslim forces in those regions. And this long process is sometimes called the Reconquista. It took about 700 years to eventually push out Muslim control of territories within Spain and Portugal. So the Templars go there in the 1130s. There are some Templars that are operating in these areas. They're fighting alongside King Alfonso, and therefore he decides to leave them this enormous chunk of the wealth of his kingdom when he dies. A third of a kingdom? This is huge. Now, once the lawyers and the other parties in the will got together, the Templars didn't get the entire third of the kingdom, but they still got a substantially large amount of revenue as a result of this will. So this is a huge boost to their economic fortunes. A string of other bequests and donations also began to come in, especially from nobles in France. And this leads to the Templars beginning to set up houses or offices in a number of countries. They have houses in France, Spain, and England, as well as other parts of Europe, and these offices function as places where they can receive bequests and donations, but they're also centers of operation from which the Templars can manage properties that have been given to them or entrusted to their care. And we'll get to that part in just a moment. But what we begin to see is this distributed income system where the Templars have control or ownership of property in various places in Western Europe. They need local offices to manage those properties, and they have serfs working on these properties to generate revenue off the land and pay rent or percentages taxation to their Templar landlords. So very quickly, there's this international income-generating system that the Templars begin to build into their organization. Even more significantly, the Pope grants them autonomy. And what this means is that the Templars are only answerable to their own Grand Master, who's one of them, or to the Pope himself. They're not answerable to any king or any other regional church authority. That means they don't have to pay taxes or tithes to anybody else. Any of the income they generate, they get to keep, and they can operate basically answerable to only the Pope or themselves. And this is going to be very significant in how the history of the Templars will unfold in the Second Crusade, as we will see later on. So very quickly, from an initial group of just 9 knights, we have this rapid expansion of Templar membership and institutional presence. We have offices that are forming across Europe, properties that they're now involved with managing or collecting revenues from, and even in Jerusalem itself, in the Templar headquarters at Temple Mount, there are many other people than just Templar knights and their sergeants and their priests. For example, there are Muslim, Syrian cavalry that the Templars employ to augment their military presence. These guys are called Turcopoles. So they are present. They're people that the Templars work with or hire. There are also blacksmiths, armorers, stonemasons, cooks, and so on. So it's a hive of activity, and it's a very rapid shift from an initial austere, hand-me-down, charitable order to something that is acquiring an enormous institutional presence and involving many other people besides the Templars themselves. Now, the Templars were not the only people who were fusing monastic duties with knightly roles in Jerusalem. There was actually another group of people that had already experimented a little bit with this, and they are called the Hospitallers. Now, the Hospitallers pre-exist the Templars. In fact, they were formed even before the First Crusade. There was a hospital that was set up to assist pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, and the Hospitallers are operating in 1048. So that's nearly 50 years before the First Crusade that kicks off in 1096. They're already present, providing medical care and hospital facilities to pilgrims. But in its early days, these hospital facilities were provided by monks and nuns. By 1113, the men were formally recognized as a new order, the Hospitallers of St. John. This was a reflection of the fact that their duties were now primarily medical, rather than just medical services being performed by guys who were mostly monks. The emphasis had shifted from mostly monks to mostly medical, and that's what the Hospitallers of St. John designation in 1113 indicates. As time went on, their duties would expand from running hospitals for pilgrims to hiring knights to protect pilgrims and provide armed escorts. And so the evolution of what the Hospitallers start doing is going to be influenced by what they see the Templars begin to do from 1119 when the Templars form. So there is sort of a mutual influence that these two groups of men have on each other as they develop in Jerusalem. Eventually, the use of knights would become a permanent part of the Hospitallers of St. John. And at this point, they become known as the Knights Hospitaller or the Knights of St. John. And many historians think that this evolution is a direct response to the Templar model that they had witnessed next door. The Knights Hospitaller would eventually transform centuries later into the Knights of Malta when they moved their operations from Jerusalem to the island of Malta. And later still, the Knights of Malta would evolve into a humanitarian organization that is active even today called Malteser International. Furthermore, St. John's Ambulance, another humanitarian organization that is active today, traces its origin all the way back to the Knights of St. John or the Hospitallers. So it's amazing to think that we have humanitarian organizations active today that have been in existence in some form for 1,000 years and originated at this historical moment in the Crusader state of Jerusalem. Okay, so back now to the Templars. The Templars as a knightly order are a vehicle for channeling Western military men into service in the Near East in the Crusader states. And this was pretty important because in the interim between the end of the First Crusade in 1099 and the beginning of the Second Crusade in 1147, you're looking at nearly 50 years when there's no major military influx into the Crusader states. And as a result, they're in constant need of manpower because they're far outnumbered by their potentially hostile neighbors. And they're perpetually struggling to maintain their territories against neighbors who would happily gobble them up. Men who wished to serve in the Holy Land could sign up at any local Templar house, be transported over to Jerusalem, and serve for a fixed amount of time before returning back home. They need not take on the full Templar commitment to a quasi-monastic life. And if they didn't want to be full knights even for a fixed amount of time, there were many other ways that a man could serve the organization, whether it was by blacksmithing or being a sergeant or being an infantryman, and these positions didn't require the full monastic commitment. Those knights who could not sign up in person could provide donations to the order, and in this way they could sort of do their spiritual duty and receive some spiritual credit for that support. So there are many ways that you can support Christian forces in what was sometimes called outre-mer, the French word which means over the sea, and this was a word that was used to refer to all the Crusader lands in their entirety. So how many Templars were there exactly? Some records state that at their very peak, there were only between 15 to 20,000 Templars, and of that number, only about 10% or 1 or 2,000 were actual knights. Now, in addition to knights, you'd have some of those men who are sergeants at arms and infantrymen, but the vast majority of those people weren't involved directly in combat activities. They would have been involved in economic activities, in administrative and accounting activities, which are going to be a huge part of the significance of the order, as we're about to see. As the Templars increase in wealth and size, the structure of their organization has to evolve as well. And so there are a number of formal positions that become core to Templar organization. The highest ranking official in the order was the Grand Master. And as we've already said, he is elected by the Templars themselves. He is one of their number, a Templar Knight. And as time went on, he would be elected only by senior Templar Knights. These senior Templar Knights are called the Grand Chapter. So they're sort of the oldest guys, the ones with the most experience. They're going to elect one of their own number as the Grand Master. And while the Grand Master is involved in making all major decisions, such as when the Templars are going to go to war, when they might make a peace alliance, any other sort of military decisions, he can't make these things entirely autonomously. He's required to consult with the other senior knights in the Grand Chapter. The Grand Master is assisted by another official called a seneschal, and this man you can think of as the Grand Master's right-hand man. He's his trusted advisor and also his deputy, someone who can step in and speak for the Grand Master if necessary whenever the occasion requires it. Then there is the Marshal. Think of the Marshal as like a quartermaster. His job is to provision the troops. So he's in charge of purchasing horses, weapons, war materials, making sure that the Templars have whatever they need to do whatever military activities are required. Then there's the Draper. And this is an office that sounds like it's related to fabric because it was. The Draper you can think of as the master of the robes. He's in charge of making sure that Templars all have uniforms, but also bed linens, sheets, and other fabrics that they might require. He's also in charge of redistributing any gifts that come into the order. So, like I said, if a grateful pilgrim decided to donate his fur cloak, something very expensive, or a rich robe to the Templars, the individual Templar who received it wasn't allowed to keep it as his personal property. It would have to be handed over to the Draper, and the Draper would redistribute this as resources that belonged to the organization to whomever needed it most. Then there were provincial masters, and this is perhaps the most late developing position within the organization. So as the Templars begin to set up these chapter houses in France, England, and Spain, they're also going to places like Portugal, southern Italy, and even Hungary. So each of these local chapters will have a provincial master, someone who's in charge of the organization in that particular country. But all of these provincial masters are still answerable to the Grand Master, who's at the top of the hierarchy and is located at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, who's ultimately in charge of all the Templars and all the houses everywhere. One of the decisions that a Grand Master had to make was whether or not the Templars would acquire various castles in the region, in Outremer, in the Near East. And even today, there are astonishing castles and fortresses that stand as testament to Templar activity in the region at this time. Some of the most striking are Krak de Chevalier in modern Syria, Krak Castle in modern Jordan, and Sidon Sea Castle in modern Lebanon. As the Templars grew in wealth and size, many existing castles and fortresses that the Crusader states had built were handed over to the Templars to renovate, to staff, and to use to maintain security in the region. So the Grand Master would have to make a decision. If there was a king or a ruler who was going to hand over a castle, was he going to take it? Did he have the forces to man it? Could they supply the funds to renovate it? How is it going to play a role in the strategic necessities that the Templars were most concerned about at that time? Over 50 castles were built in Outremer, many of them staffed by the Templars, and the Templars also built castles in Spain and Portugal as part of their action against Muslim forces in the Reconquista that I already mentioned. As the Templars are increasing in size, they're increasing in the number of roles that they take on. And one of those roles is banking. Now, why? Why would the Templars, these warrior monks, be involved in banking? To understand this, we have to step back and take a look at the mechanics of moving money around in the 1100s or the early 12th century. This was very difficult. If you were taking money from Western Europe into the Near East, you were running a huge amount of risk. First of all, there were the bandits we just talked about earlier, right? You were very much at risk of being stopped and robbed at knife point and having all of your valuables taken away, at which point you have no recourse. You've just lost everything. So that's an extremely high risk to run. But it's not as though you could take a bag of money into the Near East, put it down somewhere, and then withdraw some of it at an ATM some kilometers away. That banking system doesn't exist at this time. So in order to deal with the hazards of transporting finances across continents, the Templars begin to step in and play this role on behalf of the pilgrims who they are sworn to serve and protect. So a nobleman could leave his entire property or a set of valuables in the hands of the Templars by checking in and having a conversation with the Templars at one of their local chapter houses in, say, England or France. So the nobleman would sit down and he would detail what valuables or property he was going to put in the care of the Templars. The Templar in that office would make a very detailed record of this and the value of the property or objects that were being handed over. The Templar would then issue that nobleman with a credit note. And when the nobleman got on to a ship and headed over to the Near East and was then going to be doing his pilgrimage, he could then show this credit note to Templar headquarters and withdraw some portion of the value that he'd already entrusted to the organization. And so this becomes a safe and secure way of accessing local capital, which is guarded by these armed warrior monks. You're going to take out as much as you need, not more. You can always come back to the chapter house and withdraw more against the value that you've sort of deposited there. And this way you're not running around the Near East with all of the money you need for your trip, which could be easily removed from you by a bandit. So in this way, the Templars end up being in charge not just of valuable items, but even of managing large properties for years at a time while their noble owners are on pilgrimage in the Near East. So a nobleman might say, here is my estate. While I'm gone for the next couple of years, I'm going to turn it over to the Templars to manage. During that time, the Templars would be extracting revenues from it. They would be making sure that things operated well. And this is now an investment. It provides liquid funds that they would be in charge of. But in addition to managing property in a banking sense, the Templars are also traders. And for this, they begin to build their own fleet of ships. Now, we don't know exactly how many ships the Templars had. There's evidence that they built a number of warships as well as a number of merchant caravels. If they needed additional ships, they would hire them, as was the practice for most people at this time. Among the items that the Templars purchased and traded were things like grain, oil, wine, cloth, wool, and slaves. So no doubt you heard of the white slave trade, and you probably associate it with the Ottoman Empire. But that empire began at the very end of the 13th century, and this white slave trade was alive and well long before that. In the 12th century, slave trading was already a very lucrative business, and this is the time period we're in right now. The early 1100s, the 12th century, the slave trade is already extremely active. The slaves were often Turkish, Greek, Russian, or Circassian. They were often brought to market by Turkish or Mongolian slavers who rounded up boys from across the Eurasian steppe and transported them towards the center of the slave trade in the Near East. After being sold at market, these boys and girls were often transported by Venetian or Genoan merchants, Italians, who are moving slaves up and down the Mediterranean and elsewhere on their merchant ships. When the Egyptians bought slaves, they often used them as slave soldiers, sometimes called Mamluks. And the Mamluks play a huge role in the Egyptian military of the 12th century, and they're so significant that later on, in 1250, they actually take over and become the Mamluk dynasty, the slave soldier dynasty. But that's a story for another episode. My point is that slaves are being bought and sold across the region, and everyone is doing it, including the Templars. So young men are purchased as slaves by both the Templars and the Hospitaller Order, and in the case of the Templars, these young men are often put to work on Templar estates in places like Aragon in Spain. In fact, the Templars even established their own wharf in a town called Ayas, in present-day Turkey, which becomes a major hub for this buying and selling of human cargo. Imagine for a moment a young boy growing up somewhere on the plains of the Eurasian steppe, perhaps in a place we now call Russia. He's probably a shepherd. He's out there on the plains taking care of his father's sheep, and he's suddenly ambushed by a party of slavers. These guys are mounted, they are dangerous, they are vicious, they grab him and they tie him up, they throw him on the back of a horse, and before he knows it, terrified and bruised, he's being transported miles away from any territory he recognizes. Terrified, he'll be in the company of his captors for weeks or even months as they make their way westward. Eventually, he'll end up in some slave market, possibly in a place like Ayas, on a wharf somewhere, and he'll be purchased by some lean, bearded man in a white robe with a red cross on it. And from there, he'll be loaded onto a ship, and he'll travel for weeks or months again, this time to another continent. He'll end up perhaps somewhere in Spain, where he'll be put to work inside a Templar house. He'll be surrounded by men who speak a language that he doesn't understand, whose religious observances will be equally strange to him. Our young shepherd might be a Christian, growing up on the Eurasian steppe, but if he is, he'll be an Eastern Christian, an Orthodox Christian. And so the observances of these Latin Christian Templars, who are now his masters, are going to take some getting used to. They will seem incredibly foreign. Perhaps they'll put this young man to work in the fields. Perhaps he'll be assigned to assist a blacksmith or an armorer. He's now a servant of the order. And while every Templar considered himself a servant of the order, the difference was that they had voluntarily signed themselves over to it, whereas this young man is their involuntary slave. I do not mention this example to villainize the Templars. Most likely, this young man would have been treated better by them than by some other masters he might have had, given that they already had rules against beating squires and they were supposed to be celibate. But this is only to point out a fact of this period that is often overlooked. Slaves were routinely taken on raids by Mongols, Turks, Arabs, Franks, and Vikings alike. These slave traders are sometimes Muslim and sometimes Christian, and the people that they are enslaving and transporting are sometimes Muslim, sometimes Buddhist, and sometimes Christian. There wasn't a major religious difference here. Slaves were sold across markets in the Near East and purchased by all kinds of people, from Muslim states to the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, which had a long tradition of slavery going back to centuries before in the Roman Empire and its history, and continuing right along to this point in the 12th century. Christians could and did buy other enslaved Christians, although it helped if they were from a place much farther away. Furthermore, we also have ample evidence that Muslims were taken captive and enslaved in the Crusader states at this period. And again, this was common in the region, but if you had Crusader forces that took over a Muslim town, they would often enslave members of that population, men and women alike, and they'd be put to work on construction projects or blacksmithing or whatever it was that was needed. And we know this because there were actually laws in the Crusader state of Jerusalem about keeping slaves. And these laws said that if you're a Muslim slave converted to Christianity, you had to set them free. Now, Pope Gregory IX closed this loophole in 1237 when he said, slaves must be permitted to hear Christianity and they can convert if they want to, but that doesn't change their status as slaves. This same pope, by the way, also complained that when Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, came to the Near East in 1227, that he rounded up 100 Muslim slaves that were then owned by the Crusader states, including the Templars, and handed them back to Muslim powers in the region without compensating the Templars for their lost property. So there's plenty of documentary evidence that this was going on. Sometimes you're purchasing slaves at the slave markets, and sometimes you're making slaves by enslaving populations of areas that you now control. Now, all of this predated the sub-Saharan African slave trade that would become such a huge feature of economics in Europe several centuries later, although there were sub-Saharan Africans who were bought and sold at this time as well. For example, we have a record from 1067, which is 30 years before the First Crusade, of an Iberian Christian, someone in a place we would now call Spain, called Arnalus Mironis, who sends 10 sub-Saharan African slaves to Pope Alexander I as a gift. Think of this. The Pope himself is owning slaves, and because they're black, they're sub-Saharan, they're sort of a status item. They're exotic. They're something that enhances his prestige. So even the Pope is doing it at this point in history. And we have popes speaking out and giving laws about the owning of slaves in Jerusalem. So it's hardly surprising that the Templars would be engaged in this as well. As the landholdings of the Templars increased, the need for labor to work on these lands did also, and so slave purchase and ownership was part of this economic system. So we've been talking about all these other activities the Templars are engaged in, from trading and banking and property management and recruitment and all this sort of stuff. But their primary role, their most important mission by far, was military in the Near East. And they play an incredibly important role in the Second and Third Crusade. Now, this episode is not about the Second and Third Crusade. I'm going to deal with those things in a separate series of podcasts. But briefly speaking, the King of France brings a bunch of men into the Near East on the Second Crusade. But the French army is so badly organized, they end up not following orders correctly, getting fragmented, and exposing themselves to huge dangers. At which point the French king actually asks the Templars to take charge of organizing these men and of giving them direction on how to move militarily through the region, how to minimize their risk of casualties and ambush attacks, without Templar military intelligence, the Second Crusade would have been even more of a debacle than it was. And it wasn't just military expertise that they provided. The King of France had money problems. At a certain point in the Second Crusade, he doesn't have the funds to support his men in the field. And who does he turn to? The Templars. And the amount of money he asks them for is equal to half of the annual tax revenue of the Kingdom of France at this period. That's an astonishing amount of money. And even more astonishing, the Templars came up with it. So this is just to give you a brief sense of how absolutely vital the Templars are to the other military activities that the Crusades will be undertaking in the years to come. But I'm going to leave the other details of the Crusades for another day. I want to tell you a different story, because one of the most fascinating stories of the Templars involves the actual assassins. Yes, the ones that are mentioned in the computer game Assassin's Creed, but this is the real assassins. So let me tell you a little bit about who these guys were, why they're important, and how the Templars end up tangled up with them. So the assassins are kind of a radical group of fighters led by a guy called Rashid al-Din Sinan, sometimes called the Old Man of the Mountains. And their headquarters is the fortress of Alamut, which is located in Persia, or modern-day Iran. Now, the assassins are a splinter sect from an already minority group. So briefly, the Muslim world is divided into two separate parts. The majority of Muslims are called Sunni Muslims, and by some accounts, that's as many as 90% of them. The remainder, some 10 to 13%, are called Shia or Shi'i Muslim. So the Shia are already a small minority of the total Muslim population in the world. These assassins were a small splinter from the Shia minority. So they're a tiny, tiny group from an already small minority of Muslims. Some people claim that the assassins get their name from hashish, like the hashishin, the men who take hashish, and that this is the evolution of the word assassin, because legend has it that these men were fanatically devoted to their leader, Rashid al-Din Sinan. They would do whatever he asked them to do, and many of their activities involved murdering high-profile people, usually Sunni Muslims, that were perceived as their enemies. And these guys would go on missions where they would sort of embed themselves as undercover agents close to their target. They would gain that person's trust, they would get close to them, and then at a critical moment, they would pull out a knife and kill that person. And in many cases, these were suicide missions. These assassins, or hashishin, didn't make it back, but they were absolutely devoted to following the orders that they were given, even if that meant their own destruction. And so as a result, they were very dangerous, because kind of like kamikazes and other suicide missions, if you've got someone who doesn't expect to get out alive, they have nothing to lose. They're much more dangerous. They already expect to die, and so they can't be expected to turn and run or to be cautious in these situations. So there are many stories about these assassins. Think of them as a minority player in the region, but a small group of people that have developed an outsized reputation for effectively taking out the leaders of their enemies. And they're not just located in Alamut in Persia. They actually have a number of outposts, some of them very close to Templar-controlled territory. So the assassins have some hideouts in the Nosiri Mountains, and one of them is as close as 5 miles from a Templar location. So they're neighbors. Now, in general, the assassins left the Templars alone, largely because taking out an individual Templar would accomplish very little. He would be immediately replaced by other members of the order. So the assassins tended to focus their efforts on higher profile leaders who would be large percentage hits. If you took them out, it would have a big effect. Most Templar knights don't fit this description, so the assassins generally leave them alone. And in fact, they pay the Templars a large amount of money. Some records say 2,000 gold bezants a year for the Templars to leave them alone. So they're right next to each other, but generally they don't mix. Now, in 1173, King Amalric of Jerusalem, a Crusader king, decides that he wants to negotiate a peace treaty with the assassins. And this is because he wants to remove them from the picture as a threat he needs to worry about, so that both the assassins and the Crusaders can focus on their mutual enemies, the much larger Sunni forces in Syria and Egypt. The assassins hate the Sunnis. The Crusaders are worried about Sunni Muslims. So King Amalric thinks this is a great opportunity for us to just shake hands and say, we're not going to fight each other. Let's both focus our energies on the larger problem here. So the assassins send an envoy, a guy by the name of Abdullah, to negotiate with King Amalric in Jerusalem. And one of Abdullah's negotiating points is that he says to Amalric of Jerusalem, we're willing to make a deal with you, but this means that the annual payment of 2,000 gold bezants that we're handing over to the Templars can stop. Because if we're allies, we don't need to be paying this anymore. And King Amalric is saying, you know what, that's reasonable. I think that we can definitely include that in the deal, no worries. And there's also some reports that suggest that King Amalric wanted the assassins to convert to Christianity. And that would really put his mind at ease to know that when we're not just on the same side at this moment, but we're on the same side sort of in a larger theological, political sense as well. And Abdullah may have been willing to entertain this. So they hash out the terms of the deal. So the king sets down these terms in letters that he bestows upon Abdullah to take back to the old man of the mountains, Rashid al-Din Sinan. And Abdullah is on his way. He's very, very close to assassin-controlled territory when he's suddenly ambushed. He's ambushed by a group of Templars led by a one-eyed Templar knight, and they murder Abdullah. So this is a shocking event, and it has huge political implications. First of all, King Amalric is absolutely furious because now it's going to seem to the leader of the assassins that King Amalric himself was not negotiating in good faith, that this whole talk of a peace treaty was some sort of a trick, and he was actually just murdering the envoy. So it makes King Amalric look really very bad, and he has to work extremely hard to convince Rashid al-Din Sinan that, no, this wasn't me, I had nothing to do with this murder, and I'm going to find the people who did it and punish them. But the slaying of this envoy absolutely murdered the peace deal as well. At this point, even if Rashid al-Din Sinan is willing to believe that Amalric didn't do it, he's no longer willing to sign any sort of treaty. So that diplomacy has failed. Now, this is seen as a good thing by the Templars, obviously. Otherwise, why would they have done it? One possible motive is that the Templars wanted to keep the payments that they were receiving every year from the assassins. And if Amalric made this deal, that payment would have stopped. So they did have an economic incentive to scupper the deal. But in their defense, the Templars would probably have said, no, we weren't doing this for money. We were doing this because King Amalric was dangerously exposing himself and us to an unreliable ally. The Templars didn't believe that the assassins would ever actually convert to Christianity or that they had anything but their own interests at heart, always. And so they were very concerned that Amalric would believe whatever treaty negotiations were made, think that the assassins were on the same side, and therefore move his military attention and forces in another direction, leaving himself open to attack from these same assassins. The Templars didn't trust them. They thought no matter what these guys say, on paper or in person, you can't believe them. And so we weren't going to let the king make a deal that was going to be a military risk for all of us. This is likely what the Templars would have said to justify their action. It's hard to know from a vantage point of 1,000 years later what was actually going through the minds of the Templars at the time. But we do know that King Amalric sent word to the Templar Grand Master, who was after all in Jerusalem, not far away, and said, I want the head of this one-eyed knight who was responsible for leading this ambush and murdering the envoy. And the Grand Master says, nope, I'm not handing him over. And furthermore, we Templars are not answerable to you anyway, King Amalric of Jerusalem. This is a matter for our own internal discipline. I, the Grand Master, will investigate whatever happened here and do what needs to be done if there's any disciplining involved. But otherwise, we answer only to the Pope. We don't need to hand over anyone to you. So think about this for a second. The King of Jerusalem has just been engaged in diplomacy that he sees as making his kingdom safer. These Templars, who are located next door, have, on their own initiative, terminated that diplomacy, made the king look bad, and eliminated the possibility of a deal. And now they're not even offering an explanation. They're not even going to punish one of their members symbolically. They're basically saying, we don't answer to you. We're not responsible to you. And we're not saying sorry. And that's the end of the conversation. It's not hard to see how accusations that the Templars were very arrogant and that they were pursuing their own interests in the region would begin to emerge. And this is a reputation that is going to have a very long shadow for the Templars. Now, in the end, the king manages to seize this one-eyed knight and throw him into a dungeon, but that's the end of the matter. And he doesn't even have the capacity to do anything else, to punish the Templars, to bring them to heel, or to provide himself with any kind of assurance that they won't do something similar again. This kind of high-handed behavior by the Templars made it credible for people to begin to think that they were operating to pursue their own interests in the region, that they were no longer fighting for or under the King of Jerusalem, that they were operating on agendas of their own, lending money to some kings, terminating the diplomatic negotiations of others, accruing large amounts of wealth. The Templars were beginning to make some enemies, and while they were widely admired for being excellent fighters and brave men, there was some concern that their agendas might be entirely their own. And the dealings of Templars with kings are eventually going to be what leads to their undoing. But for that story, you'll have to come back for the next episode. I hope you've enjoyed episode 1 on the Templars. If you did, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what happens to the Templars after this. And if you really enjoyed it, please consider becoming part of the podcast community on patreon.com/Eva Schubert, where you can get access to even more stories about the Crusades and whatever other historical period I'm currently buried in research with, as well as live conversations with me on all things historical. Thank you for being here, and I hope I'll see you in the next episode on the Templars.